Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm pre-recording this video because it has been announced in our village that there will be an expected electricity outage at around 10:30 that will end around 4 p.m. So in preparation for that, I'm preparing this video where we will be discussing the urogenital system as well as the post-lab for the digestive and respiratory systems. So as a reminder for everyone, the expected output for Module 12 would be your worksheet to be accomplished on or before January 26 at 10:30 a.m. Please take note of the access code on the screen and also the recitation, the deadline of which is on the same date. So let's proceed to the post-lab of the digestive and respiratory systems. So for the first photomicrograph showing a cross-section of the liver, the structure pointed at A is the hepatic lobule, as we discussed during the pre-lab last meeting, and the cells pointed at B would be the hepatocyte. For the cross-section of a pancreas, the structure at A would be the functional unit called the acini, and B would be the functional unit or the group called islets of Langerhans. For the different structures in the mouth of the toad, you have the median subrostal fossa at A, which locks with the tuberculum prelinguale in G. B is the upper lip fold, and F would be the lower lip fold. C is the eyeball prominence, where the rest of the eyeball of the toad is resting. D would be the openings to the eustachian tube that gives access to the vocal sacs as well as the, the vocal cords of the toad. And then finally, E would be the tongue. For the organs found in the abdominal structure of the toad that represents the stomach and the intestines, A is the gallbladder that stores the bile from the liver. B would be one of the lobes of the liver. C is the stomach, which can be divided into three parts, the cardiac, fundus, and pyloric regions. The connective tissue that attaches the stomach to the body of the frog is called the mesogaster. D is the pancreas, and E represents the ileum of the small intestine. Now, for the questions for the digestive system, trace the pathway of food through the digestive tract. So it starts with the mouth, where the food undergoes mastication, passes through the glottis that ensures that only solid particles go through the digestive tract, and that they do not go to the respiratory system. The food then goes to the esophagus, the stomach, where majority of the contents are digested, small intestine for absorption of most biomolecules, large intestine for absorption of water and vitamins, rectum for temporary storage of undigested products, and anus for expulsion to the environment. Now, you were then asked to list down the accessory structures and glands associated with the digestion process and to indicate their role in digestion. For the salivary glands, they secrete saliva for the digestion of various biomolecules, including carbohydrates, care of the salivary amylase, lipids, care of the lingual lipase, and proteins, care of salivary kallikrein. The saliva also lubricates the passage of food and allows it to move smoothly down the digestive tract. The pancreas produces trypsin and chymotrypsin, the highly acidic compounds needed to digest proteins. But the pancreas is also responsible for producing insulin that regulates blood sugar levels. The liver in turn produces bile to help digest fats, and the gallbladder, which is associated with the liver, helps store bile. You were then asked to correlate the structural changes in each segment of the digestive tract with function. So the mouth is hinged, it has a hard upper palate, and it contains the tongue. So the tongue helps capture food. The teeth, on the other hand, helps grind food. But apart from that, the structure of the mouth is hinged, so it helps in capturing and grinding the food. The esophagus is a relatively stiff structure supported by cartilage. It serves as a funnel for the pre-digested food that is the product of mastication in the mouth, aka the bolus. It ensures that food is transmitted successfully and efficiently to the stomach and not to the lungs. The stomach is an expandable pouch with folds inside called the rugae, and this is to help it carry as much food as possible and to maximize the surface area for digestion. The small intestine is a long and narrow tube with foldings inside. This makes sure that the nutrient absorption is at a slow but efficient pace. But at the same time, the folds are present to maximize surface area, also to maximize absorption of needed nutrients in the food. The large intestine, on the other hand, is also long, but it's relatively wider. So this allows for reabsorption of water and vitamins, and also makes it a flexible temporary storage for waste. Next, you were then asked to relate the histological appearance of the liver and pancreas with their function. When you say histological, we refer to the tissue structure. So the liver is made up of hepatocytes that are grouped together into functional units called globules. In each lobule, you'll find one central vein that drains the blood from the liver, and the portal veins also. The hepatic artery supplies the blood to your liver, and then each lobule would have its own bile duct to collect the bile that is produced by the liver. The sinusoids are found between the lobules, which serves as a passageway for bile to go into the bile duct. And then for the pancreas, it's made up of acini, and then within the acini, you would find the blood vessels that are needed to supply nutrients also to the organ system and drain blood from it. You have intercalated ducts that receive the hormones and enzymes produced by the pancreas. And then all of these hormones are collected via the interlobular ducts found within the acini and transmitted out of the pancreas via the intralobular ducts. Now for the recitation of the digestive system. So you were asked to give a biomolecule and the enzyme responsible for digesting it in the mouth. Carbohydrates are digested by salivary amylase, lipids by lingual lipase, and proteins by salivary calicrate. Now, to differentiate hepatocytes from hepatic sinusoids, so the hepatocytes are the cells that make up the liver, whereas the sinusoids are the spaces in between them that receive the bile that is produced by the hepatocytes. Differentiate acini from islets of Langerhans. So the acini are the functional units of the pancreas, whereas the islets of Langerhans are often made up of a collection of acini, as well as the different blood vessels and ducts that are needed to collect the products of the acini. Next, give a biomolecule absorbed in the small intestine and a molecule absorbed in the large intestine. So the small intestine is responsible for absorbing majority of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, whereas the large intestine is mostly reabsorbing water to prevent dehydration, vitamins, and a small amount of lipids as well. Now, would the organism still be able to digest properly without the gallbladder? Why or why not? So the gallbladder is an accessory structure because it serves as a temporary storage for bile to make sure that there is a controlled release into the digestive system. Without the gallbladder, digestion is still possible, but the digestion of lipids would become a little bit more inefficient because the bile would be drained directly into the digestive tract instead of experiencing controlled release via the gallbladder. Now let's move on to the respiratory system. So for the photomicrograph of the cross-section of the frog's lungs, A represents the interalveolar septum, while B is a cross-section of the alveoli. As for the different structures in the toad, A is the heart and B would be the lungs. You were then asked to trace the flow of the air from the nostrils to the alveoli. So from the nostrils or the external nares, the air goes to the pharynx and then to the trachea. The trachea then splits into two major bronchi. And then from each bronchi, it splits into smaller bronchioles and eventually the air is deposited into the alveoli. So what accounts for the spongy texture of the lungs? Pretty straightforward. the alveoli, which helps maximize the surface area of the lungs for maximum oxygen absorption. What is the functional significance of the rich blood supply in the walls of the lungs? So this is to make sure that majority of the oxygen that is being absorbed by the alveoli is directly um, transferred to the blood that is being deposited by the pulmonary artery, in such that when blood is returned to the heart through the pulmonary vein, it has received or experienced maximum oxygenation. Now for the recitation for the respiratory system, you were asked to differentiate external from internal respiration. So external respiration would be the exchange of air between the lungs and the environment. So that's when we exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Internal respiration, on the other hand, is when oxygen and carbon dioxide are swapped between the different organs present in the body and the blood vessels that either provide oxygen or pick up carbon dioxide. We have a third type of respiration, which is cellular respiration, which involves the use of oxygen to produce ATP from carbohydrates. Describe the mechanism that allows the toad to breathe through its skin. So the skin of the toad is continuously moist, and it is in close contact with a lot of blood vessels. The moisture on the skin of the toad allows oxygen to dissolve in it, and thus allowing it also to diffuse directly into the blood vessels, helping the toad ensure that its muscles and organs are continuously oxygenated, whether it's on the surface or underwater. Discuss the physical need for alveoli as it relates to the efficiency of the lungs. So again, the alveoli maximizes the surface area present in the lungs that absorbs oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. So this makes sure that maximum oxygenation is achieved when it comes to the blood that passes through the lungs. And then why is the heart and lungs closely associated? The lungs is responsible for the acquisition of oxygen, whereas the heart is responsible for the distribution of oxygen and other nutrients throughout the body. And thus, they need to be closely associated. When the frog breathes, does the air pass through the vocal cords? Why or why not? Air has to pass through the vocal cords in order for it to be able to create sound. But there is a more direct pathway straight to the lungs of the toad that does not need to pass through the vocal cords. The pathway through the vocal cords is an accessory pathway that allows the toad to make sounds, especially during sexual reproduction. And speaking of sexual reproduction, we now move forward to the urogenital system. So the term urogenital is a combination of the Greek words oro, meaning urine, and genitalis, that refers to reproduction. In more advanced organisms, these are two separate systems, specifically the urinary system, with its main organ being the kidney, and of course the reproductive system, which is hugely varied in males and females. But an interesting thing about the organs found in the urogenital system is that both organs actually develop from a common germ layer origin during the early developmental stages of the toad. And for simpler organisms and for males, they actually utilize common pathways or ducts to release their products. So they are usually studied together. Now, when it comes to the excretory system, the main organ would be the kidneys. They are often found dorsal to all other organs in the abdominal cavity of the toad and also in humans. So they're usually described as having a retroperitoneal position. The functional units of kidneys are nephrons. So nephrons remove waste products of metabolism from the body, as well as regulate the amount of ions inside the body of animals. So later we'll be tracing the pathway of urine in a nephron. But basically, once urine or urea from the kidneys, which it extracts from our blood, it's collected by the mesonephric duct, which is also known as the Wolffian duct, which in turn conveys the urine to the urinary bladder. And then the urinary bladder temporarily stores this urine until it is full, and thus eventually it is released to the environment through the cloaca. Now, what you're seeing here is a cross-section of the kidney where you will see some of its important structures. So the glomerulus basically is the functional unit of the kidney. So the glomerulus together will create a bigger structure called the renal corpuscle. Now, the renal corpuscle would have glomerulus, capillaries that supply blood, and the Bowman's capsule. So the Bowman's capsule, which you're seeing here surrounding the glomeruli, would basically be a clear spherical area that helps protect your glomerulus. Now, interspersed among the renal corpuscles, so that's the functional unit that is made up of the glomeruli, the Bowman's capsule, and capillaries, would be renal tubules. So these are larger structures that are responsible for, again, collecting the urine that is extracted within the glomerulus. So if you combine the renal corpuscle and the renal tubules, then you would have the nephron, which is the functional unit of the kidney. Okay? So if you look at the photomicrograph provided in the worksheet, structure A is pointing at a glomerulus, and B, on the other hand, is part of the Bowman's capsule surrounding another glomerulus. So for the glomerulus in A, the Bowman's capsule is this portion here that I'm pointing at, using at my pointer. For B, this is the Bowman's capsule of this larger glomerulus here. Okay. Next. So when it comes to the reproductive system, both males and females usually have paired gonads. So gonads is a general term we use to refer to sexual structures. In males, you have the testes, and in females, you have the ovaries. They are basically the primary organs responsible for the production of gametes. And an exclusive event happens there, which is basically meiosis. Apart from that, they are also the sources of important hormones needed for the development and sexual maturation of the organism. So in males, for example, they're mostly responsible for the production of testosterone, and females for estrogen and progesterone. So looking at the cross-section of the testes, okay, so there would be compartmentalized ovoid structures within it. These compartments represent portions of a structure called seminiferous tubules. The cells lining the seminiferous tubules are called germinal epithelia, which are responsible for undergoing meiosis that produces sperm cells. If you focus on the seminiferous tubules, you would see sperm cells in various levels of development. The mature sperm cells are elongated and fibrous in nature, whereas the immature ones are ovoid. So if you look at the photomicrograph in the worksheet, A is actually pointing at the collection of mature sperm, and C is pointing at the ovoid structures of the immature sperm. B, on the other hand, is basically pointing at the seminiferous tubules. Now, if you look at a frog ovary, its cross-section, you would see a lot of immature cells, immature egg cells that are arranged into individual follicles. And individual follicles are generally composed of oocytes and follicle cells. Now, the outside wall of your ovary that more or less covers the oocytes and the follicle cells is a structure called theca externa. Now, if you look specifically at one primary oocyte, okay, you will see we have some present in various stages of maturity. And the degree of maturation can be determined by the amount of yolky material accumulated in the cytoplasm. The more yolk, the more mature it is. So if you look at one mature oocyte specifically, you would be able to take note that its nucleus is enlarged. This special nucleus is called the germinal vesicle. Its nuclear membrane is also serrated um, to allow for the fusion with the nucleus of the sperm cell later on during fertilization. Now, on the surface of the nucleus, you will have nucleoli, and their primary function is in organizing the distribution of accumulating yolk in the growing oocyte. So, if you look at um, the cell membrane of the oocyte under HPO, you would be able to recognize the ovoid cells lying immediately outside the cell membrane. So these are significantly smaller and are not viewable at LPO. But these cells that are immediately outside the cell membrane of a mature oocyte are the follicle cells, which function in providing nutrition to the growing oocyte. Surrounding the follicle cells would be thin layers of connective tissue called the theca interna. And again, it's only viewable under HPO. So the theca interna is also called the cyst wall, but it does not cover the whole egg cell. It is actually absent at the region of the location where a rupture will eventually end up in during ovulation and release of the cells. The cyst wall, or the theca interna, basically forces the egg to separate out from the surrounding follicle cells because it is already mature. So if you look at the cross-section of the frog ovary in the worksheet, A would be the germinal vesicle and B is showing the theca externa. Now let's put a focus on the structure of the kidneys before we look at the gross anatomy of the urogenital system. So if you look at the basic structure of kidneys, you would have your renal parenchyma. So this is the portion of the kidney in general that basically is responsible for filtering blood and making urine. Beside the renal parenchyma, you will find the collecting system that collects the urine from the parenchyma and transfer it to a tunnel-like area, which basically serves as a pathway to move urine out of the kidney into the ureter. Now, associated with this system would be the renal artery that supplies blood to the kidney and is also the one that supplies blood that the kidney will filter. The renal vein, on the other hand, drains blood from the kidney, and here, the blood that passes through here, although it is deoxygenated, has also been partially purified by the kidney itself. The ureter is a tube that carries urine produced in the kidney to the bladder. So in terms of urine formation, the first event that happens is called glomerular filtration. At this point, water and salts that are usually smaller than proteins are forced through the capillary walls and pores of the glomerular capsule into the renal tubule. So all the excess solutes are basically removed. So that's why if you have a high salt diet, your kidneys are often overworked. From there, after water and solutes pass through the glomerulus, it then goes through the various tubes, okay, the renal tubules specifically, where reabsorption of water, sugar, amino acids, and essential ions are occurring. So these are transported out of the filtrate into the tubule cells so that they can re-enter the bloodstream through the glomerular capillaries. And then finally, the last stage of urine formation would be tubular secretion. Hydrogen ions, potassium ions, creatinine, and drugs are basically removed from the blood and secreted by the tubular cells into the filtrate. So that's why the kidneys are actually stressed when you drink a lot of medicine and if you drink them frequently, because they're responsible for removing the unused components so that you can pee it out. And that's why drinking excess vitamins can also be stressful to your kidneys because they also consider this as waste products and they filter it out, and so they are removed to your you removed from your body through the urine. So when it comes to the gross anatomy of the urogenital system of the toad, you will see various structures when you open up the abdominal portion of the toad. One of the key organs to look for would be the kidneys. Okay, they are creamy brownish structures, elongated in shape, found at, as we described earlier, the retroperitoneal region of the animal. They lie close to the dorsal body wall, okay, and are separated from the main body cavity by a semi-membranous peritoneum. So the kidney here is pointed at letter C. Now, at the middle portion of your kidneys, here where the exact pointer actually is, you would find a yellowish strip of tissue if you were able to dissect the toad fresh, okay? And this is called the chromaffin tissue, which is basically equivalent to the adrenal glands, the one that produces adrenaline, okay? And in the case of the image shown here, the chromaffin tissue is not visible. Now, from the outer margins of the kidney, you can find the mesonephric duct, okay? So this one here, which is also called the Wolffian duct. So this serves as a passageway for both urine and sperm eventually. Now, at the lower portions here, which this pin crosses over, you would actually find the urinary bladder. So it's a soft mass of thin tissue and is bilobed in the case of toads. It has an opening that allows urine to empty into the cloaca. Now, since the mesonephric duct opens into the cloaca, urine usually backs up into the urinary bladder from the cloaca unless the aperture or vent is open. Okay, so minsan bumabalik. Lalo na pag nagsiswim yung toad. Okay. Now, since this is a male structure, you would be able to see the testes. So it's about a yellowish brown structure found at the ventral surface of each kidney. So here, in this case, it's surprisingly large. Usually the testes is small. So we chose this picture because the testes is pretty obvious. So testes is singular, testes is plural. So the mesentery that keeps the testes in place is the mesorchium. Now, associated with it are thin tubules that you won't be able to see in the image because it's smaller, would be the vas efferentia. These are small, slender tubes lying on the mesorchium that basically conduct the sperm from the testes to the kidney. Please take note, however, that the sperm do not enter the kidney. They just pass through the tubes that the kidney is associated with. Now, the mesonephric duct found at the margins of the kidney is also called the vas deferens. So this one is the vas deferens. So the vas deferens is synonymous to mesonephric duct and Wolffian duct. Okay. So again, as mentioned earlier, they serve as passageway for both sperm and urine. Now, another interesting structure here would be the fat bodies or the corpora adiposa. So these are yellowish finger-like structures that serve as additional sources of nutrition, especially during reproduction, mostly because during the reproductive season, toads often forget to eat, and thus they would need additional sources of energy. Now, anterior to the testes would be a Bidder's organ. So it's obscured in this image, but this is a grayish mass of tissue that represents the rudimentary ovary. So basically, if you remove the testes of the toad, the Bidder's organ would basically become a functional ovary, and the toad would transition from being male to female. So let's now look at the female urogenital system. So the first structure that you should be able to see at the anteriormost portion would be the ovaries, okay? So they're usually lobulated. They're made up of many lobes. They're described as saccular because the lobes are generally sacs, okay? So the ovaries are responsible for producing egg cells, and the mesenteries that hold them to the body wall is called the mesovarium. So during closing to the dates where the toad will need to reproduce, the ovary can become very enlarged, especially when the small globular pigmented eggs are produced. But if the toad is relatively young and has not yet undergone reproduction, then the young ovary would appear white and folded. Okay. Now, close to them would be the corpora adiposa as well. Again, storage of energy, especially during reproduction. Now, posterior to the ovary would have white long tubes, which are the oviducts. So these are the oviducts, as I'm pointing at the arrow here, okay, using my mouse. So the oviducts are also called the Muellerian ducts, and they basically help funnel the maturing egg cells from the ovaries towards a structure called the ostium. Okay, so the ostium is the most anterior funnel-shaped opening of the oviduct. They serve as the entrance of eggs which are released from the ovary into the body cavity. Okay, so that's where the eggs enter the body cavity. Now, if you go down the oviduct, it enlarges into a distensible sac called the uterine enlargement, which is here. Now, the uterine enlargement temporarily stores the eggs when they're about ready to be released into the environment. And so the uterine enlargement basically is connected to the cloaca, where the eggs are released to the environment as well. So that is basically the pathway of the female urogenital system. Now, of course, before the egg cells or the sperm exits the environment, they have to undergo production, of course. And this is through the process of meiosis. So meiosis is like a modified method of cell division where you initially start with a diploid cell and it undergoes 2 rounds of cell division so that you eventually end up with 4 haploid cells. The primary difference between the egg development and the sperm development would be the physiological changes they undergo immediately after meiosis. In the case of an egg cell, more often than not, 3 out of the 4 cells are reabsorbed by the egg cell or become accessory structures to help nourish the single egg cell that will enlarge and become responsible for serving as a point of fertilization. Sperm cells, on the other hand, typically all 4 sperm cells mature and develop specialized structures such as the flagella and a functional head in order for it to undergo movement or motility during reproduction. So what's interesting about the egg cells and sperm cells of toads is that compared to humans, our egg cells and sperm cells are generally microscopic in nature. In the case of toads, they're significantly larger because they undergo a process called external reproduction, wherein reproduction occurs in an outside environment. And this, the enlargement of the gametes is essential to make sure that they are able to, one, protect themselves in an external environment, and second, that they increase the likelihood that the sperm will find the egg. Okay. Now, in our case, they're microscopic in nature, mostly because we encounter what is known as internal reproduction, where reproduction occurs in a protected, safe environment. Now, external reproduction is still risky, despite the existence of large egg cells and large sperm cells, because they're very much vulnerable to fluctuations in environmental conditions, such as temperature, humidity, and pressure. And at the same time, they're prone to predation from other animals. And that's why organisms that undergo external reproduction have to produce a lot of egg cells and sperm cells at one time to make sure that it increases the probability of survival of the next generation of organisms because there is a high likelihood that majority of them will not. In the case of organisms that undergo internal reproduction, more often than not, reproduction is done one at a time. Um, one egg cell is attempted to be fertilized by a lot of sperm cells, and the process of gestation occurs in a protected environment so that all energy of the mother is focused in the proper development of the organism. Okay? So that's it for our lesson today. Again, please take note of the worksheet that you will have to complete on or before Tuesday next week and the code that I provided at the start of this lecture. So my apologies for not being able to hold our synchronous session because we will be having or experiencing a power interruption today. So thank you very much, everyone, and I guess I'll see you next week.